Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I am going to be sharing my thoughts on the final book in the Morganville Vampire series, Daylighters. Daylighters is the culminating end to the Morganville Vampire series, a 15-book series that has spanned the course of almost 10 years, I believe. And the end of this, oh boy, I have some good thoughts with this one. So to backtrack before I go into the synopsis of what exactly the last book of the series entails. When I first read this series, it was in high school, and when I had gotten to the very last book, I was immensely impressed with what happened in the story, and I loved how the entirety of the series wrapped up, even if it was a little on the faster side. And now, several years later, after having read that particular book again, I have many of the same feelings, but I think that I have just a little bit more love for it. So the events of the last book, which was Fall of Night, essentially leaves us on not exactly a cliffhanger, but a issue of sorts that has risen. When Claire goes to MIT in Fall of Night, she finds out that there is this group of people who are looking to kill off the vampires or use them in some kind of experimental kind of capacity, and they are what are called the Daylighters. They are a foundation of human individuals that are looking to essentially eradicate vampires. And the way that they're doing it, that is discussed in the book Daylighters, is that the founder of the Daylighters has what he thinks to be a cure that will essentially revert the physiological status of the vampire to revert to human. But it's unclear as to whether or not this thing actually works. He claims it's a cure, but we don't know if it really is. The beginning of the story picks up essentially right where the last book left off, where the gang essentially goes back from MIT all the way back to Morganville with this doctor named Irene Anderson, who we find out in Fall of Night is essentially someone who we thought was a good guy and is not. And when they get to Morganville, they find out that the entire town has been taken over by the humans, and with the help of the Daylight Foundation, have essentially taken all of the vampires that were in the town into some kind of protective custody where they are being corralled and they are being treated as prisoners. So the entirety of Daylighters is essentially the group trying to figure out what exactly to do in order to not necessarily bring the vampires back into power in a full capacity, but they're trying to figure out how to bring down the Daylighters, because even though the vampires themselves have caused many grievances over the course of the time that Claire has been there specifically, they still do not deserve the kind of treatment that the Daylighters are trying to do. Essentially, the reason I think this book is timely is that it basically goes into who is the real evil when it comes to everything that's happening. So we have a lot of issues going on right now in the real world that involve talking about who is really to blame for the amount of violence that is happening in our world. So this goes into a lot of that, of defining who is the real evil in this scenario. And the whole team, essentially from start to finish, is in peril. Not only are their physical beings in peril, but even the glass house, the house that Claire has been a part of for the last 2, now almost 3 years, is in peril. It is being threatened to be bulldozed down because it is a symbol of what used to be in this town. The Daylight Foundation wants to eradicate everything that has to do with the vampires. So not only do Claire and the team have to essentially save the vampires, but they actually have to save their house from being bulldozed down. The thing I loved the most about this book, I think, was the overall pacing of the story. The later books in this series I've found have been well written in terms of pacing. And I think that's because the books themselves had gotten longer over the course of time, and there was a lot more complex plots being involved. But in general, this book's pacing was actually really well done, because while it was incredibly intense the entirety of the story, we did have well drawn out scenes that didn't feel like they were super rushed. We were given all the information that we needed to, and it didn't feel like Rachel Kane was just throwing things at us and expecting them to stick. She was throwing things at us and they were sticking, and she wanted to make them stick by going into them a little bit deeper in terms of discussing different topics that have been brought up over the course of the series. One of which being the fact that even Michael's marriage in the story that takes place a couple books back is not considered a real relationship according to the Daylight Foundation, because Michael is a vampire and Eve is a human. Then as far as the characters within Daylighters, they're still incredibly consistent in terms of the last several books that I have read in this series. I've said this before about the other books, but not only do the plots become more complex once we hit about phase 2 and phase 3 of the series, we also actually end up getting more complex characters. Now, granted, this entire series is mostly seen from Claire's perspective, but in some of the books we get other perspectives over the course of time. Daylighters is mostly in Claire's perspective as well, but we do get things from like Shane, who seems to be kind of the other perspective within all of this. I don't remember off the top of my head if there were other characters that really got perspectives within Daylighters specifically, but at least in both Fall of Night and Daylighters, we see not only Claire's perspective, but Shane. Whereas in like Bitter Blood and Bite Club and Ghost Town, things of that nature, we were starting to see more perspectives play into it. And then the last two books really focus on Shane and Claire, as they're really the ones that I think we as readers become more invested in, because not only are they a couple, but they both have interesting plot points within each of those books that gives them kind of that purpose to being the perspective. So in terms of how the story feels now that I have read it for the first time since high school, it felt amazing. The ending of it was still, I think, one of my most favorite endings I've ever had for a series. It felt like everything wrapped up very nicely, but not too nicely to the point where everything is sunshine and rainbows at the very end. There was a lot of promise, though, in terms of what to expect going on in this world after this series ends, because I like to think that in any world that you get involved in, regardless of where it ends in the plot, there is still so much to be done in each world. Like, you don't know necessarily what always happens, because it's very open-ended for a lot of reasons. We don't really know necessarily if things are going to go completely back to normal in this series, but we get at least an inkling of hope that things are going to be very different, considering how the last several books have indicated that things really need to change when it comes to the way that the vampires and the humans interact with each other. It truly just made my heart happy, the very end, and it reminded me so much of how many feelings I had for the series when I had first finished it. And the ending scene of the book itself actually left me very teary, because it was incredibly sweet, and it was bittersweet at the same time, because it's the end of the series and I didn't want it to end, but the way that it ended, I think, fit the story well enough to where it left things open-ended, but didn't do so much that there were so many questions where there would have to have been another book. So, Daylighters, I ended up giving a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. Now, let's go into the overall series in general. So, as I've stated before, I consider there to be 3 phases of the Morganville Vampire. The first phase includes books 1 through 8, which I have omnibuses of 2 books each within those. Books 1 through 8 really go into a lot of clear understanding exactly the inner workings of Morganville itself, and we come across several different kinds of villains within that. One villain in particular spans the course of about 2 or 3 books, and so he does a lot of damage within all of that. But the first phase really takes place over these ones, because they're still incredibly juvenile in terms of the writing. It hadn't been until after book 8 that Rachel Kane's writing, to me, had seemed to have gotten really crisper. And because the books themselves were a little bit more juvenile and a little bit less complex, they also were incredibly shorter. Each of the first 8 books are about 200 to 250, almost cresting sometimes 300 pages, but it's not until book 9 that we actually get over the 300 page mark, where we have a full-on complex story. And to go into in depth which books I mean when I talk about phases 1 and what books are what, the first phase I would include to have books 1 and 2, Glass Houses and The Dead Girls Dance. Books 3 and 4, Midnight Alley and Feast of Fools. Books 5 and 6, Lord of Misrule and Carpe Corpus. And finally, books 7 and 8, Fade Out and Kiss of Death. Now, going into phase 2, after having completed the entirety of the series, my mind has kind of changed over what I think is phase 2, because I think that phase 2 encompasses really where the complexity of the story is within the entirety of the series. This includes books 9 through 13, which include Ghost Town, Bite Club, Last Breath, Black Dawn, and Bitter Blood. In these books, we see a much more complex story, we see much more complex characters, and we even start to see more perspectives being played into the story. The first book that actually crests over 300 pages in terms of the stories themselves is book 9, Ghost Town, where we start seeing a lot more interesting things happen in the town. They're very odd in terms of what we already know of Morganville, and some things in this story become incredibly apparent in terms of the relationships between the characters and truly how they feel for each other, because especially when we get to book 10, Bite Club, we learn a lot about Shane's perspective and how he feels about a lot of the things that have been going on since the beginning of the series. And then finally, I consider Phase 3 to be the last 2 books within the series, which are Fall of Night and Daylighters, because Fall of Night essentially has us go through, for one, a whole scenery change, because we are now following Claire as opposed to being in Morganville at MIT out in Boston, essentially the Boston area. And here we also learn of a brand new set of enemies that span the course of not only that book, but the last book, Daylighters, and they are essentially the last enemy that we really see within the series. In terms of my overall enjoyment of the series, I think that what I have realized is Rachel Caine has really grown into being a writer. I've said this over the course of several of these reviews of this series, but the first 8 books of the series are more juvenilely written because they were towards not necessarily the beginning of her career, but I think the beginning of what was to be her better writing, because I've not read any of her older books that came out in like the early 90s or anything, but these books in particular, being YA paranormal kind of stories, were not written in the way that we would want them to be written now. They're very much products of their time, with the first book having come out in like 2003, and it's not apparent in terms of the time period that they were written for, that they're from that time period, but the writing itself isn't as crisp and isn't as concise and clear cut as I think we would expect it to be in 2020. But once you get through the first 8 books, if you can handle it, because I know that a lot of people would not be okay with the juvenile writing scheme and some of the kind of stereotypical characters that are involved with this, if you get past those ones and you get to Phase 2, starting with Ghost Town, you do see that the writing itself actually does become much more complex along with the plot and the characters, and it becomes so gratifying to see that change, because you see that Rachel Caine gets into her stride when it comes to understanding these characters, and you really see that the writing has blossomed and she's learned over the course of this series what is going to work best for her in terms of telling this story. I think that goes without saying that pretty much my entirety of reading this series was amazing. I loved reading every single one, and if I had to pick a favorite, I think my top 3 favorites would be Fall of Night, Daylighters, and Ghost Town. So those are my thoughts on not only Daylighters, but the Morganville Vampire series as a whole. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing this reading series that I have done. I feel very, very satisfied having now read the entire series again and still having the same feelings that I had for it when I first read it for the first time with my grandmother when I was in high school. And it's just so fun. Like, this series honestly is very fun to me. This is one I think that I would constantly go back to. And I think that if I do go back to read these again, I'm going to be annotating, because I did tab, I think, the first 2 omnibuses and I didn't write in them. But I think that I would go back through and tab the rest and also annotate all of the physical books I have. I do though want to get the last few books physically, because I have Bitter Blood, an audiobook that I bought off of Audible that wasn't really great. I didn't like the audiobook so much of that. And I have both Fall of Night and Daylighters on my Kindle, but I would like to have all of the books physically. So I think that maybe for my birthday, what I'll do for myself, which is in July, is buy the last 3 books physically. So let me know what you guys thought of this series, if you were following along with me with the series. What were your thoughts on maybe the last book if you've read it, and what do you think about the series in general? Thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlette in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!